Okay, we might get things started. I'm Jock Given and welcome to the session on screen business in the regions. Susan Kerrigan and Mark Ryan are presenting. Mark is just having some difficulty getting into the forum at this stage, but we will see him shortly, I'm sure. So Susan, if you can begin, please.
Yeah, hi. I'm just going to start with a welcome to country and an acknowledgement really that I'm presenting from the unceded lands of the Wonnarua Nation in New South Wales, and I'll pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Mark and I are presenting today on screen business in the region, so balancing the production of corporate and passion projects. So this research has come out of a really much larger ARC linkage project on creative industries. It was a project run by QUT and the University of Newcastle, which is where I'm from. And we had 5 linkage partners: Arts Queensland, Create New South Wales, Creative Victoria, Arts South Australia, and the WA Department of Local Government, Sport and Cultural Industries. It really was a hotspot study on regional areas, and we did quant and qual, so really some really big data drawing on census statistics and employment statistics, ABN statistics, as well as gross regional products, that kind of detail. We had a very wonderful statistician, Marion McCutcheon, who helped us with that. And then after selecting the hotspots, we went out and did ethnographic fieldwork and spoke to people in the regions about the work that they were doing inside the creative industries. And this presentation is actually a slither of that creative industries work, because we're going to bring it right down to the area of screen industries. So the hotspots, where did we go? Basically, there were 17 sites across Australia that were researched from the quant and qual point of view. And those hotspots were selected based on the compiling of a whole lot of geographical statistical reports around local government areas in Australia. And there were a number of different indicators around the selection of the hotspot sites, which included employment and intensity for creative services and cultural productions, people employed as embedded creatives in non-creative industries, and entrepreneurial activity. We looked at Australian Business Register data, the size and growth of the industry sectors, and demographics of population for each of those sites. So we presented our partners with that kind of data, and then they came up with this selection of hotspots. The New South Wales team, Philip McIntyre and myself, we did New South Wales and Victoria. So we did Coffs Harbour and Bellingen, Marrickville, Wollongong and Albury. And in Victoria, we did Wodonga, Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong and the Surf Coast. Mark was working with the QUT team, and they did Queensland, Cairns, Central West Queensland, which was Blackall, Tambo, Longreach and Winton, the Sunshine Coast and the Gold Coast. And in WA, they did Geraldton, Fremantle and East Fremantle, Busselton and Albany in Denmark. And just in terms of getting your mindset into this big quant data set, we worked out from the census statistics that there, in 2016, there were 706,700 creative workers employed in Australia in the creative industries, which represented 5.5% of the Australian workforce. And that rate, that employment rate was growing at nearly twice the rate of the current workforce. So there was quite a lot going on there. In terms of this presentation, we're going to narrow it right down to these 4 hotspots. So Gold Coast, Fremantle, Wollongong and Geelong. And we're just going to talk about, in terms of the creative industries, just that little red square there. The creative industries is quite broad. Many of you might know this, made up of arts, design, media and IT. And inside media, we're going to narrow it right down to just film and television. So when we looked at the literature in terms of screen production, there are a number of different reports that are out there already, as well as scholarly research. So drawing on the Deloitte's report from 2016, which is on the Screen Australia website, it says that the screen production ecosystem creates economic activity worth 2.6 billion in 2016, and they were estimating full-time employment of about 20,000 people. Our statistics differ to that. We've actually got more people employed because we cut the data in a different way, and I'll explain that in detail. Also, we are defining screen production as that really highly capital intensive activity that requires a combination of individual creativity and the mass production of symbolic and cultural goods. Also, just pointing to some of the individual research that has been done. So in Northern Rivers in New South Wales, the Gold Coast in Queensland, and in the Hunter region also, we're drawing on the research of Karina Avignon, Ben Goldsmith, Tom Regan, Kathy Henkel, and myself and my colleague Philip McIntyre, because all of those scholars have done deeper dives into particularly screen and film production and festivals inside those regional areas. So when we move into understanding how we come up with some employment statistics across Australia broadly, the figure we came up with was 35,000 people were working in the screen industries in Australia, and that's broken down into the creative trident. I'm not sure whether people are aware of the creative trident, which is a methodology that came out of QUT, but I will be explaining it here, just breaking it down in detail. So the first up, the creative specialists are there, and we found from our data there was about 8,700 workers earning a primary income in the creative screen production sector, and they would be people working in film, TV and radio specialists in the screen industries, the people you'd call key creatives on film sets, producers, directors, cinematographers, editors, film technicians, that kind of people. We also looked at what's called embedded creatives. So they're people working as filmmakers but employed in non-creative industries. And there was about 9,100 of those from the 2016 Census Statistics. And the easiest way to explain them would be, you know, people making training videos for their corporations, mining or education, that kind of thing. The other very large employing sector inside the screen industries is support workers, and there's 17,000 people that were earning their primary income as support workers, so supporting those working in jobs inside the screen industries. And in that sense, you can think of accountants and human resources personnel. You can also think of cinemas and people's working as ushers and projectionists and front of house staff. They're classified as support workers. So breaking that down just a little bit further, you can see there we've got how it breaks down across the capital cities and including the Gold Coast. You can see these figures here that Sydney actually has the largest number of employees, then followed by Melbourne. And now this is not surprising at all, you see, and then Brisbane. And then it comes right down to the lowest number of people employed, which is in Greater Hobart, and it's broken up again by specialist workers, embedded, and the support workers. Moving those figures a bit further along into our hotspots, particularly we were trying to work out exactly how many people were employed, because in each of these hotspots or these LGAs, the census data is all de-identified, so you don't know who the people are. And in some of the areas where there are really, really small numbers, sometimes there might be 3 people working in the area, but the data shows 0 because they're trying to protect the anonymity of the census participants. So that's not so great for the field work, but we were still trying to, that's why we went into the field to try to see who was actually doing the work, what kind of work they were doing. So in terms of population, we then have total employment for each of the regions, and then we have the total employment in terms of creative industries, and then we're bringing it down even further to employment in terms of screen production. And you can see the Gold Coast has 27% of creative industries employment sits inside screen industries. So it's very high on the Gold Coast. Not surprising that we picked that as a hotspot for this study. And then Wollongong has 19%, Geelong has much smaller at 7%, and Fremantle, surprisingly, have not a lot of people being employed in the screen industries, 220, but it's at 16% of creative industries employment, so quite high. This also breaks down even further when you draw on the census statistics. It's the box people tick on the census form, and it's also how that the census categorises that employment in terms of these occupational names. These occupational names are a little bit problematic because they're a little bit behind the types of jobs people are actually doing, but this ABS doesn't necessarily update these occupation titles quickly because they're trying to maintain a level of continuity in terms of what the title actually means, so you can get historical data. But you can see here just the different breakdowns across the different areas and employment in related screen industries. So you've got motion pictures and post-production services, free-to-air cable as well. And quite interestingly, again, the Gold Coast is very high across all of these areas. So in terms of us assessing this employment in screen industries in these areas, we were trying to come up with some useful modes of what we found when we were on the ground and speaking to people. So we came up with 4: film attraction, commercial television and news production, local and independent film and television production, and commercial corporate screen production. So these are the 4 sectors that we're going to be talking about in the case studies. And, film attraction is probably one that most of you will know in terms of it brings in large international or interstate film and TV productions to Australia into different regional areas. And it's often, there's many financial incentives and tax breaks existing around that. In terms of commercial and television news production, we're really looking at the production of local news content and also the production of local advertising content. Local independent film and television production, we were looking at short or long form narrative-based content, such as features, documentaries, TV and web series, and theatrical release broadcast material. And then the commercial and corporate screen production is often a sector that doesn't have much attention paid to it, but it's really a fee-for-service production. Of where screen content is created and it operates without regulation from the federal government or any of the other agencies.
Hi everyone, sorry I'm late.
Great, hi Mark, glad you're here.
Oh man, that was an effort.
Yeah.
But, I might just, Susan, if you go back to that slide for 1 second.
Yeah, great.
I'll just add my bit now that I'm here.
Please do.
But just one point about these 4 modes I just wanted to mention is that the local film and television production mode that we're talking about is kind of the core priority content for the funding agencies. So they're most interested in providing funding for the narrative-based feature film, television series, documentary film, and so on. So that's the one that receives the most subvention from the screen agencies. And of course, the film attraction attracts arm's length and tax incentives and so on. But the commercial television and news and the corporate screen production modes are largely commercial services that are quite important in the regions, but are not central to kind of national debates about screen production in the country and don't necessarily receive direct public funding support or regulation. So sorry, that was just the bit I wanted to add, Susan. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hope
great.
I didn't break your flow.
Sorry, no, I then pressed something and it disappeared, but it's back now. Sorry. Thanks, Mark. It is really important to point those out because okay, so we'll just move on then. These are the 4 modes that we're going to be talking about in terms of the individual hotspots. So looking at Wollongong, Wollongong, for those who don't know, it's a population of over about 200,000 people. It's about an hour from Sydney CBD. So many people are creative migrants. So they're living in Wollongong and they work in Sydney. They might have once lived in Sydney. It's now cheaper to live in Wollongong and commute daily. And we did find that the 4 modes of screen production were occurring in Wollongong. So particularly with film attraction, it does draw in quite a lot of low budget features. Australian US co-productions are occurring there. 2017, there was a feature called Riptide. There was another one called Back of the Net in 2019. Number of reality TV shows filmed there. And there are a number of high-profile feature film workers that reside in the area. Anusha Zakesh, who's a casting agent, Colin McDougall, who's a location manager. Those kind of people live in Wollongong but work in Sydney and work nationally in the film industry. There are independent feature films being produced and made there. David Fields, who is a well-known actor, he directed a 2019 independent feature called The Combination Redemption. And there's also Screen Illawarra, which is a screen agency, which has just been going there for about 3 or 4 years now. And they're trying to get consolidate their filmmaking networks with a bunch of, events and information sessions and that kind of thing. Raise their profile a little bit and sort of separate themselves out a little bit from what's going on in Sydney particularly. Then there are 2 commercial corporate screen production businesses which were pretty standout, Y Documentaries and 10 Alphas. So both of those have never received any kind of funding from any of the screen agencies, and yet they're still managing to employ, 6 people pretty much, and the latest greatest gear, and do sort of corporate work as well as doing some small passion projects themselves. Some of those passion projects actually, like short dramatic films that 10 Alpha made, actually did lead to some commissioning of some work from New South Wales state government. So that kind of passion project actually is key calling card to allow those corporate screen production operations to actually get other kinds of work. Most importantly about Wollongong, there of course is the WIN television network is there, and it is Australia's largest privately owned regional television network. It's got 5.2 million viewers in 4 states. It does produce 150 news updates across its 16 newsrooms around the country, and that localised news content feeds into the advertising sectors in each of those regional areas as well. Geelong was the other area that I'm going to talk about before I hand over to Mark. And Geelong has a population of about 230,000 people. It's very similar in Geelong's relationship to Melbourne as Wollongong is to Sydney. So it had a much smaller screen industry there occurring there, and I think that's because a lot of the work does occur in Melbourne itself, but there were some interesting independent features and TV series and film attractions going on there. So in terms of film attraction, there was a film called Undertow made in Geelong in 2017. The writer lived in Geelong, which is probably why it was shot there. Budget of 2 million, a crew of 38, and an American cast were part of that. In terms of independent features and TV series, there's a production company called Robot Army. They are a commercial corporate production company, and they created Rostered On first as a web series, and then the second series turned into something that Channel 7 purchased. It's a sort of a comedy series about clocking on for work. And of course, Robot Army then filters over into that commercial corporate screen production sector. There were a couple of other films, Acetate Base and Crafty Fox Media, video production, offering post-production services and social media services there. I will say that since COVID's hit, I'm not sure whether Acetate Base and Crafty Fox Media are continuing. I tried to contact them again recently and I couldn't get in touch with them. So, some of these are very tiny businesses that aren't coping terribly well given the current circumstances. So, Mark, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. So Fremantle, again, I guess it's important to stress that we're looking at non-capital cities, and Fremantle is not that far from Perth. And so it benefits from being close to Perth, but in terms of being a city, it is quite a small city, roughly 30, is it 30,000 population, Susan? I can't quite remember.
Yeah, I think it was, Mark.
But it is quite small, but it is a short distance from Perth. Now, what's unique about Western Australia is that it doesn't have a film production studio. So it's not attracting international, foreign feature films to the region to film there. So film attraction is not a major part of the WA screen economy, with the exception of interstate production. So the WA government does have a fund called the Regional Film Production Fund that attracts interstate production from New South Wales, Victoria, and Queensland to the regions in WA to film. So sometimes the cities outside of Perth benefit from interstate production, but overall, due to the lack of studios, film attraction isn't a major part of the screen economy in WA. Of course, the WA government has recently announced that they will be funding the production of a studio facility in Fremantle in the future. And that is in part in an attempt to kind of capture a piece of the pie of film attraction that occurs in this country. But so Fremantle doesn't have a lot of film attraction going on, but where it does excel is in terms of local independent production, and particularly factual production. So a lot of the state's major production houses are actually based in Fremantle. And in part that is because of the proximity to Perth. So some of these companies are able to kind of be based in Fremantle, 25 minutes from Perth, and so they're able to get access to the film and television workers, labour, Screen West, and so on, which is only 25 minutes away, but they're still able to be based in kind of like the funky creative centre, which is Fremantle. But could you go back to?
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Well, I'll just take it for a sec. So 4 of the state's largest factual production houses are actually based in Fremantle. So Prospero Productions, Electric Pictures, Artemis Media, and Metamorphic Flicks. And all of these companies are quite unique because they're quite large. So Prospero Productions, at the time when I interviewed them, had 115 ongoing staff. So really large. And some of these, and I think Electric Pictures had full-time staff of 40 staff members. So in the context of the Australian screen sector, I mean, they're large companies. I forget what the exact sizes were according to the Deloitte's economics report in 2018, but I think a medium-sized company was roughly staff of 31. So Prospero, by national standards, is a large production house, and they're producing large factual series. So if you skip over to the next slide, some of the series like Outback Truckers, kind of Gold, Outback Gold, all these kind of Western Australia themed documentary series are kind of long-running series for the Discovery Channel and so on. So Prospero has 2 series running concurrently, which are up to about 8th season, 10th season, and they have, roughly between 15 and 20 episodes. So they're large in part because they're running these large series. But Prospero is also quite a diversified company. They produce their own documentaries and screen them in a 360 dome cinema. So the companies are quite large, but they're also quite diversified and innovative. So they act as a distributor, they're producing large series concurrently and so on. But it's quite unique because when we drilled down into the figures, what we discovered is that Fremantle actually really punches above the national weight in terms of the amount of factual production it's making. So if you look at the figures for 2018, Fremantle produced over 15% of the national documentary slate being produced by Australian producers, which is, the equivalent of 59.5 hours worth of factual documentary series. So really quite significant. And some of the years before that, 2016, 2017, between 7.5 and 8.5% of the national documentary slate. So although Fremantle has a population of just 30,000, it has large production houses that are producing a large volume of the nation's kind of factual documentaries. So film attraction is not a major factor in Fremantle. Local production is, but largely in factual production. But news production is a factor there. They do have local news production occurring. And there is, of course, commercial corporate production occurring as well. So those three kind of round out what's occurring in Fremantle. But it's most significant in terms of local production. Yeah, if you could jump to the next slide, Susan, sorry about that. And so Gold Coast is a much different example than the ones we have been looking at. So the Gold Coast is an anomaly in that it's massive. It has a population of over 600,000. It's the largest non-capital city in Australia. It also has the largest council, other than Brisbane, I believe it is. So it's quite a powerful kind of city, and it is technically regional. Now, we have had a bit of pushback about this from some people saying it's technically not a regional city, but it is. According to definitions from the Regional Institute of Australia and so on, I mean, technically it is regional. It's just very large. And yes, it is very close in proximity to Brisbane. And, the distance between them are kind of slowly shrinking as both kind of creep towards each other. But okay, so Gold Coast is an anomaly, but it's known primarily in the past for film attraction. So since the 80s and the building of the Village Roadshow studios, it's become a major destination for both foreign films filming at the studios and interstate production. So a large amount of economic activity occurs in the studios using those facilities and of course using locations elsewhere around the Gold Coast. But what we've discovered recently in a kind of an associated study that I led as part of the broader hotspot study was we drilled into production on the Gold Coast looking at independent production. There had been quite a lot of anecdotal evidence that a lot of independent production had started to occur outside of the studios and independent of the studios. So we looked at that, and over the last 10 years, so between 2009 and 2019, I believe it was the period of the study, there was, I think it was like 47 independent feature films had been made. Over half of those were made by Gold Coast originated production houses. They were defined as Gold Coast originated production, where they had a Gold Coast producer, writer, director, and so on. So in the last 10...
I think there's some details on this next slide.
Oh, okay, sorry, 35.
That's
it's
what
35.
you need.
Yeah, okay, awesome, thanks. Sorry, I'm not in control of my own slides, I'm missing them. Thanks a lot. So yeah, so I was right, it was 42 independent feature films, but 35 of those were kind of shot outside of the studio system, and another 7 made by Gold Coast producers were also made at the studio system. So the finding of the report was that before the early 2000s, the Gold Coast had largely been viewed as a service industry, so a destination for foreign and interstate production, and the industry largely existed to service those productions occurring in terms of providing infrastructure, below the line crew, and so on. But since the mid-2000s until 2019, there's been strong growth in the local capacity or the local screen production sector. And so a lot of independent Gold Coast originated production is being produced by Gold Coast producers, writers, and directors. And so of that number of 35 independent feature films being shot on the Gold Coast outside of the studio system, 17 of those were made by Gold Coast production houses, so about half. And the other 18 were independent features coming from, Brisbane or New South Wales, shooting on the Gold Coast, but outside of the studio system. So on the Gold Coast, film attraction's major. Independent production is becoming stronger. So one of the outcomes of the study was that the Gold Coast is no longer just a destination for foreign production. It's now becoming a hub for local independent production. It is becoming a producer of independent feature films, television series, and web series in particular. So, and all of that is a result of more people kind of being based in the Gold Coast, a growing number of key creatives staying in the Gold Coast, and a number of producers becoming more established and seeding more production on the Gold Coast. The other, in relation to our modes of production, local news production is still very vibrant on the Gold Coast. There has been a number of local programs cut in recent years, which is a shame, and it would be really nice to map our findings against Michael Thurlow's findings in relation to the independent index and the local production index, which he talked about yesterday. But you'll find on the Gold Coast that the local content production index is still relatively good, even though it has declined in recent years. And the independent index is declining, but still there. Some of the other regions that we looked at in the hotspot study have lost all their local news content production, which is seen a lot of screen professionals struggle as that was a mainstay for their employment. But and of course, commercial corporate production is really strong on the Gold Coast. I can't remember how many companies exactly we found, but a lot of the independents, what they do is they earn their money in commercial corporate production, and then they get to a point where they use that money to finance independently feature films. A lot of these producers are not sourcing public finance, and instead they're getting rich patrons from the Gold Coast and money that they earn from commercial corporate production to fund independent feature film. So it was a unique dynamic that we discovered at the Gold Coast. And with 17 features being made in the last 10 years, a lot of them are being made from self-funding or private funding coming from the Gold Coast, and a small percentage, tiny fraction of the percentage of funding is coming from public funding. So quite a unique dynamic happening on the Gold Coast. And a lot of this independent production is largely separate from the studio production happening in the Village Roadshow studios. Even though there is some interrelations, it is largely independent. So that's the key findings of the Gold Coast sector that we found.
So we move to our last slide. Really is the conclusion. Mark, do you want to wrap it up, or do you want me to lead off?
Oh, I can say a few things, Susan, and then you can wrap it up if you like.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, essentially, what we discover is that each region is quite different, and each region, if you use path dependency, which Jock was talking about yesterday, it's definitely one really interesting way to look at it. But the way we looked at it was we were trying to apply these modes to understand what the shape of the ecology was. And, it would have been interesting to have done both path dependence and the modes as a frame. But in using the modes, it kind of allowed us to look at the scale, the types of activities, but also the aspirations of some of these regions. So the Gold Coast is trying to develop independent production. They're trying to move away from this perception of just being a location for foreign feature films, and they're trying to grow that local capacity. Winton is a location where they have been put on the map by foreign production, and they're not quite in a position to develop these other modes of production because there's not, the critical mass of screen labor living in Winton. Whereas Cairns, which we didn't get a chance to talk about, has aspirations to become a hub for film attraction. Again, they used to receive quite a lot of film attraction, a decade and a half ago. That dried up. But there's a studio being built in Cairns at the moment with Screen Queensland funding. They're trying to aspire to become a destination again. So what we find is the bigger regional screen economies generally have all four categories, and those with very strong councils and often strong presence of state-based screen agencies. There's more tendency to have stronger activity in the film attraction, the smaller film economies are more reliant upon commercial corporate production, and where possible, independent feature film and television production, where it spills over into passion projects where they try and juggle with both commercial, corporate, and independently financed screen production. Would you like to add anything, Susan?
No, I think you've covered it nicely. I think the point is that passion projects, so the non-funded projects, the ones that don't get any kind of state or Screen Australia funding, they're the interesting ones to watch, because the growth of that on the Gold Coast shows that there's a change in the sector in terms of filmmakers determining what product might be, as opposed to agencies determining that. And that's an interesting change, but that kind of change is also occurring in the commercial corporate screen production sector. And I just think it's important to emphasise the interrelationships between all of these components. The small place, Coffs Harbour, was one of the hotspots that I went to, and there's a really vibrant Screen Wave festival there run by David Horsley, and that's developing some fantastic feature, like a festival program through education and through a January film festival and a couple of other arms he's got going to his business there, a distribution company as well, even though there's not really a production sector occurring at Coffs Harbour. So it's just really interesting to look at the detail of this and talk to people on the ground to find out, what they're actually doing. And I think if you I think that brings us to the end, and if you want to read about it, the article has been published and you can access it through Studies in Australasian Cinema, where it's called The Creative Sustainability of Screen Business in Regional Australia.
That's great, Susan. And Mark, thank you very much indeed. There's huge amounts of information. I found that fascinating, enormous amount to learn and digest in all of that. Questions, please. I have a few myself, but others first.
I think there's a few of us all sitting here politely wondering who want to go first.
Okay.
Bernadette, please.
I think Mel might have had her hand up before me, so I'll let her go and then I'll jump in after that.
Okay, Melanie.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for the presentation, Mark and Susan. I have a couple of questions, but I'll try and make them brief and succinct. Just firstly, I'm a PhD researcher looking at screen production happening in the Broken Hill region, and I was curious as to why that wasn't a hotspot that was sort of isolated for study. Yeah, I'd love to know your thoughts on that. And then going a bit further, I've kind of been thinking about screen production in that area being so kind of location focused. You know, they don't have a studio there, and all the films that come there are really interested in the kind of, you know, arid outback backdrop to capture on anything that happens in that region. So I wondered if you could speak to what kind of patterns you were finding in areas that had studios versus more kind of on location based infrastructure, if that makes sense. You're sort of talking about in Fremantle, a lot of the documentaries seem to be kind of location specific as well, I was thinking. So what did you find in terms of the differences between hubs with that kind of studio infrastructure and not? Yeah, that's my question for now.
There's generally the ones with studio infrastructure are very tied to local incentives, strong government patronage and advocacy, and kind of direct interaction with producers to get them there. And a lot of these kind of studio-based regions do have like a local identity that they pitch as part of why they should come, but it is very much tied to this complex interrelations between incentive-based schemes, the power and of the council, local council, but also a local kind of skill base as well. There has to be the skill base in the region. The problem with Winton at the moment is that it's got a great brand, and the festival is really tied to that brand. So they're really good at getting foreign and interstate production to film there because of that location backdrop, but they don't have an existing ongoing workforce located in Winton enough to sustain anything beyond transitory intermittent production, whereas Cairns has long had a really solid skill base up there, but their problem was that foreign production dried up. It stopped going there because it got concentrated in the capital, the capital cities. So they had been agitating for government support for a studio in Cairns for, almost a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades. And they were able to get that support because there's been such a strong labour force up there. And that had coincided with the growth in independent production up there as well. There's this Netflix series being filmed up there. There's, the director of The Straits is based in Cairns. So there was enough factors there to be attractive to get studio funding. So there's a lot of kind of complex factors that tie into the studio infrastructure to attract location-based production. But in WA's, it's a really interesting case where the Regional Film Production Fund just is a great incentive. So it's a domestic fund administered through the lottery scheme over there. There's a WA lottery scheme, and money goes into a fund called the Regional Film Fund that attracts films all over regional WA. It's not tied to a studio at all. And so that's more producers going and looking for the right locations for the stories, but they're really being lured by the incentive.
That was a great response about the facilities and infrastructure, Mark, but I'll just address the beginning of the question, why didn't we look at Broken Hill? Remember, this was a hotspot study. We were looking at all of the creative industries. So we were selecting broadly on employment statistics for all of them. Now, I'm just going to do a quick screen share. I got up the stats for you. Oh, now I can't find it. How typical is that? There are a whole lot of background statistics that we've got. Oh, it's just behind my screen. Let me see if I can screen share. These are the kinds of statistics that will blow your mind. I think it's that one. There, you should be able to see employment. This is a LGA of Broken Hill. Okay, and these are the number of people employed in terms of the creative industries in Broken Hill. So it's tiny. There's 36 creative specialists, there's 47 support workers, and there's 23 embedded creatives. And that's across all of the sectors of the creative industries. We're particularly talking about film, TV, and radio, and you can see there's really 4 people who earn their primary income from film, TV, and radio in Broken Hill, which answers the question quite simply as to why we wouldn't have selected it as part of the National Hotspot study. But what's really important, and what will be important for your research, is the detailed case studies. When you go in and talk to people, those migrants coming in, the creative migrants coming in, or the productions coming in, that's the detail that you're going to look at. But I can share with you, we can swap emails, I'll share with you some of those statistical links so that you can support your research a bit more. Remember, that's 2016. It's 2016 Census Statistics as well. There's been a recent census. Sorry, that's my phone. Terrible. There's a recent census, but we need to gather that data and to cut that data in particular ways. We'll need to do another research project for that. But
those statistics did blow my mind. Thank you. I've been looking for that kind of information, so that's very useful.
Yeah, send me an email and I'll shoot you there. You can spend hours enjoying mulling over the stats. But just remember, they're people earning their primary income. Okay, yeah. Sometimes across the creative industries, people might earn a primary income and a secondary income, and it doesn't appear in those stats. And that's the bit I'm really interested in.
Yeah, what's not being captured by those statistics. Yeah, cool. Thanks so much, guys. That was really helpful.
That's great. Thank you, Bernadette.
That segues nicely into which is, I'm not sure that it's really a question, actually. So I'm a PhD student looking at my own creative practice. I live in a country town, and I would not come up in the census as my primary income or business being creative industries. And I'm just thinking of the many people I know. So I'm in Kyneton, regional area, so that commuting distance, lots of similarities with places like Wollongong. Friend who's done a whole lot of broadcast TV lives up the road. His business is registered in Melbourne, so he wouldn't actually come up as being a country person. So I'm just sort of feeling like there's a lot of hidden material.
Yeah,
there.
the census. So the census statistics, did sort them by place of work and place of residence. Okay, so your friend who lives in Kyneton but works in Melbourne, he would have appeared in the census, but we cut them 2 different ways and came up with some different sort of hotspot maps around that. So
and obviously you're looking at bigger places if you're looking at hotspots, but I just feel like there is that hidden story, which I think you said you're interested in. Top End Wedding, a really big feature film recently. The producer lives in Kyneton, so I feel like there's a really interesting story about some of those little creative places. And then I guess my other question, which is not really a question, I'm just ranting on. I started in Ballarat TV when, before it was Win TV, when we had a helicopter and live crosses, and it was the glory days, I think, of local TV, which now just makes me officially old. I'm just curious, I guess, as to the interplay or what impact do you think it has when there is a commercial local news industry in a place, because Geelong doesn't have local news production, whether that's radio or TV, a little bit of local radio, but and some print with the Geelong 80, but it doesn't have TV news. And I guess I just wondered how much of a driver or crossover you think that is with somewhere like Wollongong. Freo a little bit different from that. It would have been, I'd love to see the data on Ballarat, which, you know, that still has some local news production, but that's really shrunk. So I guess I just wondered whether or not, you know, because you've looked at some of the production companies that then that helps fund their passion projects and becomes a bit self-seeding, whether I guess there's any benefit of having that local news production, or whether that then leads to more passion projects or other things that enrich that sector.
Look, I really think there is benefit to having local news production, and I think it's because it keeps the skills in the area delivering daily news as well as advertising to support those news bulletins. That allows local production companies to make that advertising, and those local production companies are the ones that can go on to do smaller corporates or small little drama productions, which might turn into bigger productions. There is a report on Ballarat, and it's a 40-page report, and you can access it on our website, as well as Bendigo and Geelong and Surf Coast. They're there. I remember talking to people in Bendigo who lived in Kyneton, so I actually do know where you are. But I actually think it's really important that those regional TV networks are producing local news, but that is starting to die. I think you might agree, Jock, as well. You know, NBN, which is the one in Newcastle, they've got a model with a hub, much like WIN, a hub which services 5 different regional areas. They produce five separate news bulletins, all serviced by advertising, an hour-long news. And Channel 9's just, you know, sacked the news editors, and they're starting to, they want to centralise that model, and they want to broadcast it out of you know, out of Sydney. So just like we've seen in publishing, and what I really felt in the hotspots that we went to, that the dying print media was really thick. You know, you could feel, it was palpable that the local newspapers disappearing, and the same is happening now with news. So it means that those small corporate independent commercial companies, we really need them to be strong, so that these kinds of, you know, localized productions can still continue. Otherwise, we are going to see it all contracting back to the main centres. And there's nothing wrong with it being in the main centres, you know, but it's really nice that it can also be regional. It's hard in the regions. It's just hard. You have to have multiple sources of income, multiple ways. And that's why web and digital and social media are really important aspects to this as well.
Yeah, there's less division between making independent feature films and corporate production in the regions. They tend to make both if they make independent production. Sorry, Jock, you were going to say something.
I know, I was just going to follow up with Susan. Actually, quick question for you both. With Susan, I was really interested that Newcastle is not in the group here, and I suppose as an outsider, why Wollongong and not Newcastle? And is it as simple as that Bruce Gordon decided to buy Win and not NBN? And sort of related question to Mark, I'm really interested in the relationship between the Gold Coast and Brisbane. Is the Gold Coast actually a bigger centre for screen industries than Brisbane is?
I'll answer very quickly. We didn't do the Hunter as part of the hotspot study because Philip McIntyre and I have done a Hunter project that we've already researched the creative industries in the Hunter. We'd interviewed 115 people and drew on the data. Census in the same way, and we just couldn't face it one more time. So there was no need to do it as part of this, but the material is there. I can point you towards it. And
so it's not that Newcastle is a
no.
non-producing screen area.
No, it does. It produces probably in a similar way to Wollongong, I'm going to say. It's more productive than Geelong, but it's certainly nothing like Fremantle or the Gold Coast.
Okay, thank you.
In terms of the the difference between the Gold Coast and Brisbane, in terms of the overall workforce in the Gold Coast, it's not too dissimilar to Brisbane, but a lot of, it's a tiny bit smaller, the overall workforce, but a lot of the workforce in the Gold Coast are support workers. So in Brisbane, there are more specialist screen workers in Brisbane than in the Gold Coast. But Gold Coast obviously gets a lot more foreign and interstate production filming. So in terms of pure expenditure, Gold Coast, more production happens in the Gold Coast than in Brisbane. There's no doubt about that. But in terms of local production, there are bigger production houses based in Brisbane, with Hoodlum, with the company that does Bluey, and there's a couple of like a Photon. So these are actually large production companies now by national standards in Brisbane. The Gold Coast doesn't quite have the same scale in terms of local production houses. But in terms of news production as well, there's more news production that happens in Brisbane because you've got your main networks up on the mountain, and in Gold Coast it is more your regional, local channels and so on. So depending on how you look at it. So if you look at the overall workforce, they're not too dissimilar in terms of the total number of screen workers working in the sector. Gold Coast is just under Brisbane, but there's more specialists in Brisbane, and more screen production expenditure and production occurs in the Gold Coast, but a lot of that is foreign production. And if you look at it just in terms of local production, there is probably more happening in Brisbane, but the other dynamic is a lot of Brisbane production houses will also produce at the Gold Coast. So if you break down that figure of interstate and foreign production happening on the Gold Coast, a good chunk of that is coming from Brisbane as well. So that the two are really, there's overlap between the Gold Coast and Brisbane.
Yeah.
I was keen to ask two of you, Mark and Susan, around the funding on the Gold Coast. I thought it was interesting point that you raised around people looking to do the day job and certainly hive away enough money to produce their work through their own funding. And my question in that one is, did you get a sense that there's a way in which, working from home, dogs going off crazy, sorry, that the funding itself gave them creative license rather than having to be, strictly adhering to what Screen Queensland most likely was requiring of them?
Well, absolutely, yeah. It's both a plus and a minus, though. On the Gold Coast, a lot of the features being made are like a range of kind of genre type pictures as well. There's high ambition sci-fi films being made, such as The Occupation, which is a Netflix film at the moment, and there was Occupation Rainfall, which came out of the Gold Coast. Now, these are really big ambition films, but relatively low budget independent production. But there is script issues as well. So they are quite creative, they're very ambitious, they're very special effects heavy. But in terms of high quality storytelling, there are issues with some of these films, and a lot of these features as well. A lot of them don't get great distribution deals because they are self-funded or privately funded, and so there are problems with the quality of some of these products because they are going outside of the formal screen sector and screen Queensland funding and so on. But they're ambitious, they're innovative, they're quirky, they're genre picks. So that's what's kind of going for them on the Gold Coast.
Just a quick question about Fremantle. I'm interested in the Gold Coast example and win. It feels like, and it's your sense about regional centres generally, there has often been a big decision, a single enterprise, which is almost like an anchor enterprise in the place. And it feels like certainly the Gold Coast Studios and Village's decision to buy a studio that someone else had built a long time ago, what was foundational for them. And it feels like in Wollongong as well, obviously Gordon's role there, but I'm interested in Fremantle. Was there someone who sort of put the stake in the ground and said, we're going to be a centre of documentary and factual here, or has it been more organic than that?
Yeah, it's been really organic. And it really is being driven by those 4 companies that have somehow gotten quite large. And, these are long-running companies, Prospero and Electric Pictures and so on. They've been around for 20, 30 years. And it's a phenomenon of Western Australia that I think they work closely with Screen West, the development agency, and Screen West has tended to fund production houses rather than individual projects as much. So it has been a conscious decision to fund enterprises. And as far as I can tell, it's been an organic thing where these companies have worked closely with the screen agencies and have just gotten quite big over time. There's no anchoring event or anything that I can see out of Fremantle. It's just become the centre, and it really is because of proximity to Perth as well. They have access to all the film workers living and working in Perth. They have the luxury of kind of being a very creative hub in Fremantle, which is quite exclusive. But yeah, I mean, if Fremantle wasn't so close to Perth, it wouldn't be such a hub for factual documentary production, I don't believe.
And I may be out of date, but is it right that they were talking of putting a studio into Perth or Fremantle, or has that all happened, or is it going?
Yeah, no, it's going to be Fremantle, yeah. They have secured the funding for it, and I think it's going to be in a couple of years' time, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? We're at time, but we could fit another one if anyone has one. I have one very tiny detailed question. The numbers at the Gold Coast showed a lot of people in subscription television. Is that because Foxtel's office there is large?
Yeah, this has been such a strange point in the data. Yeah, that's what we suspect. Yeah, that's what we suspect. And we did look into it because it's a glaring kind of anomaly. Like it jumps off the page. But yeah, that's what we found. But there's offices for a major subscription service there.
Yeah, I wondered if it was a call centre or something like that.
Yeah, that's what we suspect. That's what we suspect, yeah.
It's really hard to drill down into those categories using the ABS data. Sometimes you just look at the surface level and go, how can that be right? Yeah, I
just looked at their website and they say we've got offices in Sydney, Melbourne and the Gold Coast, but then there's a number of separate sites in Sydney and Melbourne, but there's nothing special about the Gold Coast. So yeah, interested to know.
So all of the stats are in the publication, Jock, so you're welcome to dive in and grab that, and you can see them all there.
Yeah. Look, thank you very much, Susan and Mark. It's fantastic, really interesting work. And one of the real strengths is obviously that there is so much data that you're making available that is enabling other people, and Melanie's a good example with Broken Hill, to drill straight into it as foundations for work on other areas. So really great work and incredibly useful for us all. So thank you very much for the session.
Pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jock. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.